Orchestrated Canadian memoir story with fresh characters and emotional family arc. Orchestrated Canadian memoir story with fresh characters and emotional family arc. The check was for $11,000, and it came folded inside a birthday card meant for somebody who'd been dead 2 years. That's how I found out my aunt had been forging Walter's signature, not from a lawyer, not from a confession. From a card with a cartoon moose on the front that she'd grabbed off the wrong shelf at the Shoppers Drug Mart and never bothered to look at twice. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. I grew up mostly in my grandfather's house on LaSalle Boulevard in Sudbury, in the part of town where the driveways crack every spring from the frost heaving underneath, and nobody ever gets around to fixing them. My mother, Diane, had me young, and she worked nights at the regional hospital for most of my childhood, so the man who actually raised me, who taught me how to drive on the back roads out toward Whitefish, who showed me how to bleed a brake line, and how to apologize when you're wrong, that was Walter, my grandfather, her dad. He'd worked 36 years at the nickel operation, came home most nights, smelling like sulfur and borax soap, and he'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, so strong it could strip paint, and he'd ask me about my day like the answer was the most important thing he was going to hear all week. He had a workshop in the garage that he kept warmer than the house. Cedar shavings on the floor, a radio that only got one station, the one that played Gordon Lightfoot and Stompin' Tom between the farm reports. I spent more hours in that garage than I did in any classroom, and I learned more there too. Walter wasn't a rich man. People up north rarely are, but he was careful in a way that his generation understood and mine mostly doesn't. He paid the house off in 1989 and never carried a balance on anything again. He had GICs at the credit union that he rolled over every 5 years, the same way other men go to church. When my grandmother passed, I was 9. He didn't fall apart the way I expected. He got quieter, that's all. He started making 2 cups of tea in the morning and pouring one down the sink, and he did that for years before I noticed. And when I finally asked him about it, he just said, "Habit's a hard thing to break, bud," and changed the subject. My mother had one sister, Colette. And I want to be fair here, because it would be easy to make Colette into a villain from the first sentence, and the truth is messier than that. When I was a kid, she was the fun aunt. She'd show up at Christmas with presents that were too expensive, and a husband, Desmond, who told jokes and let me sip his beer when nobody was looking. She lived down in Mississauga. She'd married into money, or what looked like money. Desmond sold commercial real estate, and they had a house in a subdivision where all the lawns were the exact same shade of green, and the garages were bigger than Walter's whole main floor. But here's the thing about Colette. She came up north for funerals and not much else. When Walter's hip went and he needed someone to drive him to his appointments at Health Sciences North, it was me. When the furnace died in February of one of those -30 stretches and he was running space heaters in the kitchen too proud to call anybody, it was me he finally called, and it was me who drove across the city at 11 at night and sat with him until the on-call guy from the heating company showed up. Colette sent a card. The card said, "Thinking of you." She was thinking of him from a 4.5-hour drive away, where it was warm. I didn't resent it. I want to be clear about that too. I genuinely didn't. Not then. I had a good thing with my grandfather, and I knew it. I dropped out of college after 1 year, communications, which even at 19 I knew was a polite word for no idea, and I'd gone into the trades instead. Got my red seal as an electrician by the time I was 25. Walter was prouder of that ticket than my mother was of anything I ever did, and I don't say that to be cruel to her. She just measured success in a way she'd inherited from somewhere, and Walter measured it in whether you could look a man in the eye and finish what you started. So when Walter started slipping, I was the one who was there to see it. It was small at first. He'd tell me a story he'd told me the week before, word for word, and look genuinely surprised when I knew the ending. He left the truck running in the driveway one afternoon for 2 hours. He started writing things on a notepad by the phone, reminders, names, the day of the week, in his blocky engineer's printing, and the notepad got thicker and the printing got shakier. The doctor used the word vascular, said it was the small strokes, the kind you don't even feel, each one taking a little piece. Said it would come in steps, not a slope. Good days and bad days, and over time more of the second kind. I moved back in. I was 30 by then, renting a basement apartment in the Donovan, and it wasn't much of a sacrifice to give it up. I told myself it was temporary. I told everyone it was temporary. Walter, on a good day, said, "You don't have to do this, you know. I'm not your problem." And on a bad day, he called me by my late uncle's name and asked when his shift ended. I learned things about him in that year I'd never have learned otherwise. I found a box of letters he'd written to my grandmother during a stretch in the 70s when he'd gone out west to work the rigs because the mine was on strike and they needed the money. He never mailed half of them. They were just there. In his careful hand, this whole flood of feeling from a man I'd only ever known as quiet. I sat on the floor of his closet and read them, and I'm not ashamed to say I cried, which I hadn't done in years. I found the financial stuff too, because somebody had to. He kept everything in a green metal cash box that he thought was a secret and wasn't. The house, paid off, worth maybe $340 in that market. The GICs at the credit union, which came to a little over $90,000. A small pension that died with him and a bit of CPP and OAS that kept the lights on. That was it. That was the whole estate of a man who'd worked 36 years underground. 340,000 in bricks and 90 in the bank. And to a guy from Mississauga, where the houses start at $1.5 million, I imagine that looked like nothing. But I didn't think about the money. I want that on the record. I genuinely did not sit in my dying grandfather's house and think about the money because I was too busy thinking about how to get him to eat and how to tell when the confusion was the disease and when it was just an old man being stubborn and whether the smell in the back bedroom meant I needed to start dealing with things I wasn't ready to deal with. Colette started calling more around then. That should have told me something. She'd call on Sunday evenings and she'd ask how Dad was doing in this bright, careful voice, and then she'd ask every single time about the arrangements, whether he'd sorted out his affairs, whether there was a power of attorney and who had it. There was. He'd named me. He'd done it years before, clear-headed, sitting in a lawyer's office on Cedar Street with a woman named Heather Whitfield who'd handled his stuff since the 90s. Power of attorney for property and personal care, both me. I'd never asked for it. He'd just done it and told me after, the way he did most things. When Colette found that out, the temperature of those phone calls changed. It started gentle, concern dressed up as logic. I just think, with everything on your plate, you shouldn't have to manage his finances too. That's a lot for one person. Then it got pointier. Desmond knows people, financial people, who could make sure Dad's money is working properly. It's not really fair to him to just leave it sitting in GIC at a credit union earning nothing. And then, one Sunday in October, she said the thing she'd clearly been building toward for weeks. She said, in that bright, careful voice, "I just want to make sure nobody's taking advantage of him. He's not himself. People can be opportunistic." I sat in Walter's kitchen with the phone against my ear and the snow starting up outside the window over the sink. And it took me a second to understand that the person she was warning him about was me. I should have seen it coming. Looking back, the whole shape of it was there. But you don't want to see it. Your aunt is your aunt. She held you at your baptism. She's in the photos. She's family. And family doesn't do this. Except, of course, family is exactly who does this, because nobody else is close enough to the money to try. They came up the first weekend in November. Colette and Desmond, in a Lexus that looked absurd in that driveway, parked next to Walter's rusted-out F-150 that he wouldn't let me sell. They brought groceries, expensive ones, the kind of cheese Walter wouldn't have touched. And they brought a man. The man's name was Trevor. He was introduced as a friend of Desmond's who handles estate planning, which is a sentence that should make the hair on your neck stand up, and it did. He had a leather folio and a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes, and he wanted very much to sit down with Walter and just go over a few things. It was a bad day for Walter. They'd timed it without knowing they'd timed it, or maybe Colette knew. He'd been confused since morning. He'd asked me twice where his work boots were because he had a shift. And here was this man with the folio, leaning across the kitchen table, speaking slowly and loudly the way people do to the elderly, asking Walter if he understood that the current arrangements might not reflect his true wishes. I lost it a little, not dramatically. I'm not a yeller. But I stood up and I said the visit was over, that Walter was tired, that whatever they wanted to discuss could be discussed with me and Heather Whitfield present and not before. And Colette looked at me across her father's kitchen, the kitchen where I'd done my homework, where Walter had taught me cribbage, where my grandmother's handwriting was still on the inside of a cupboard door, listing the recipe for the only pie she ever made. And she said, "This is exactly what I was worried about. You've isolated him. You've got him all to yourself up here, and nobody can even check on him." I didn't say what I wanted to say. I want credit for that. What I said was, "You can check on him anytime you want, Colette. You haven't wanted to in 15 years. They left. The cheese stayed in the fridge for a month before I threw it out. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know until much later, was that the visit hadn't failed at all. It had succeeded, just not in the room I was in. Here's what I pieced together afterward. Over that winter, while I thought I'd held the line, Colette had been working a different angle. She couldn't get the power of attorney away from me without going to court. And court meant a capacity assessment. And a capacity assessment on a good day might have gone her way and might not. Too risky. So she went around it. She started calling Walter directly, on the landline, on the days I was at a job site. I'd taken a few small contracts that winter, just to keep my ticket current and keep some money coming in, because the POA didn't pay me a salary and I was burning through my savings. So 3 days a week, mornings, Walter was home alone with a personal support worker who came for 2 hours and a phone that rang. And on those calls, Colette was sweet as anything. She was the fun sister again, the daughter who loved her dad, and in the soft, suggestible space of a mind that was coming apart, she planted things, that I was after his money, that I was keeping her away, that he should protect himself, that he should set aside something for her, his daughter, before it was too late, before I got it all. And Walter, who on a clear day would have seen straight through it, was not having many clear days. She mailed him forms, credit union withdrawal forms. She'd send them up with a sticky note. "Dad, just sign here so I can help manage things. Love, Colette." And she'd call to walk him through it. And 3 or 4 times that winter, before I caught on, my grandfather signed checks and transfer authorizations he didn't understand to a daughter who had counted correctly on the fact that he wouldn't tell me. $11,000 went out that way before the moose card. The moose card, I told you I'd come back to it. It was March. The worst of the winter was breaking, the icicles dropping off the eaves like the house was shedding. Walter had had a stretch of better days. They came sometimes, these false thaws, and on one of them he handed me an envelope he'd had the PSW help him address. And he said, "Sheepish, can you mail this for Colette? I keep forgetting." I shouldn't have opened it. I know that. But something in the weight of it, in the way he said her name, made me sit down in the truck in the credit union parking lot and slide my thumb under the flap before I dropped it in the box. Inside was a birthday card with a cartoon moose holding a cake, the kind they sell in a sad little rack by the till, and inside the card, no message, was a check. Made out to Colette. $11,000, the credit union memo line filled in with her handwriting. I knew her handwriting from a lifetime of Christmas cards, and Walter's signature at the bottom in a shaky scrawl that wasn't quite his anymore. I sat in that parking lot for a long time. I didn't go home angry. I went home careful, which is worse. I went to the credit union first, and I sat down with the manager, a woman about my mother's age who'd known Walter for 30 years, and I laid the whole green cash box on her desk, and I said, "I need to understand what's been going out of these accounts." And she pulled the records, and her face did a thing I'll remember for the rest of my life, because she understood before I'd finished explaining what she was looking at. 11,000 to Colette in the card, 8 before that, in 3 transfers over the winter. $19,000, gone, from a dying man who'd worked underground for 36 years to put it there. That was the night I understood the thing nobody tells you. It's not the money that breaks you. Walter could have spared the 19 grand. He'd have given it to her gladly if she'd just asked him, on a clear day, like a daughter. What breaks you is the calculation. It's knowing that someone looked at a confused old man and saw a window, and climbed through it, and counted on his love for them to keep him quiet. I didn't sleep. I sat in the workshop with the one-station radio off and the cedar smell, and I tried to figure out what to do. Because here's the part nobody warns you about either. I was the one with power of attorney. I was the one legally obligated to protect his estate. And the person stealing from him was my mother's sister, my aunt family. If I went after it, if I called the police, called the OPP's elder abuse line, the number I'd already looked up at 2 in the morning, I'd be the man who put his aunt in handcuffs. I'd blow my family apart. My mother would be caught in the middle of it, and she was already drowning, watching her father disappear. And if I didn't, I'd be letting it happen. I called Heather Whitfield in the morning. I'll never forget what she said, because it reframed the whole thing. She listened to all of it, the checks, the card, the calls, and then she was quiet for a second, and she said, "Has anyone asked Walter what he wants?" And I realized nobody had. Everybody had been deciding things for him. Colette deciding he was a resource. Me deciding I was protecting him. The whole war had been fought over his head, about his money, while the man himself sat in the middle of it being talked over by people who said they loved him. So I waited for a good day, and I sat down with him at the kitchen table, 2 cups of tea, the strong kind, and I told him the truth. Slowly. Not to win, not to turn him against anybody, just because he was a grown man and it was his life and his money, and he deserved to know what was happening to it. I showed him the records. I showed him the moose card. He went very still, and then my grandfather, who I had watched lose the names of his own grandchildren, looked at that check for a long, long time, and he said in a voice that was suddenly completely clear, "I know I'm not all here anymore, Bud, but I'm not gone yet," and she knew that. That was the whole sentence. She knew that. He didn't rage. He just looked for a moment, unbearably tired and unbearably awake, and he set the card down and pushed it away with one finger like it was something that had crawled onto the table. We didn't call the police. That was his call, not mine, and I held to it even though part of me wanted blood. He said something I've thought about 1,000 times since. He said, "Putting her in a cell doesn't get me my daughter back. I lost her a long time before this," and he asked me to do 2 things instead. The first was to drive him to Cedar Street. We went to Heather Whitfield's office, the 2 of us, on the best day he'd had in a month, and he sat across from her and he changed his will. Not in anger. I watched him the whole time, and there was no anger in it, just a terrible, settled clarity. He left Colette $1, just the 1, not 0, because 0 a lawyer can fight, can claim was an oversight. $1 is a sentence. $1 says, "I saw you, I remembered you, and this is what I decided." The rest, the house, what was left of the Jikes after she'd helped herself, all of it, he left split between my mother and me, with a separate envelope from my mother that he made Heather promise to hand her privately, and I never asked what was in it, and she never told me. The second thing he asked me to do, he asked in the truck on the way home, watching the slush go by. He said, "When I'm gone, don't make this the story. Don't let what she did be the thing people remember about this family. Make it small, bury it with me." And I said, "Okay, Walter." I said okay, even though I didn't understand yet how hard a promise that would be to keep. He died in May. It was a good death, as those things go. He had a clear morning near the end. They say that happens, the rallying, the brief surfacing, and he knew me, and he said, my name, my real name, and he said, "Thank you, Bud." Then he slept, and a day later he was gone. I was holding his hand. It was warm right up until it wasn't. The funeral was at the same place we'd buried my grandmother. Colette came. Of course she came. She wore black and she cried in the front pew, and she received condolences from people who didn't know, who would never know, and I stood there, and I kept my promise. I made it small. I shook her husband Desmond's hand, I let her hug me, stiff as a board, and I said nothing. The will reading was a week later. Just the 3 of us and Heather Whitfield in the office on Cedar Street, and I watched Colette's face when Heather read the part about the $1. I watched her understand it, the cleverness of it, the precision, that her father had known all of it, the checks, the card, the calls, and had sat with it and had decided. $1. She didn't say anything in the office. She held it together. But in the parking lot afterward, by the Lexus, she turned on me and the mask came all the way off for the first time in my life, and she said I'd poisoned him against her, that I'd manipulated a dying man, that I was a thief who'd isolated him to get the house. And here's the thing I'm proudest of in this whole story. I didn't argue. I'd spent the winter wanting to argue, wanting to win, wanting to make her say it out loud and admit it. But Walter had already won the only argument that mattered in an office on Cedar Street with $1 and a clear head, and there was nothing left for me to prove. So I just looked at her, my aunt, who'd held me at my baptism, and I said the truest thing I had. I said, "He knew, Colette. At the end, he was clear, and he knew exactly who you were. That's not something I did to you. That's something you did." And then I got in the rusted-out F-150 that he'd left me along with the house, the truck he wouldn't let me sell, and I drove home. I still live in the house on LaSalle. I run my own electrical contracting business out of it now. Small, just me and a guy named Curtis, who I trust the way Walter taught to trust people, which is slowly and then completely. I took the GIC money, what was left of it, about $70,000 after Colette, and I didn't do anything clever with it. No financial friend of Desmond's, no Bay Street wizardry. I put it in a TFSA and a couple of index funds the way the boring guy at the credit union suggested, and I leave it alone, and it's slowly becoming the thing Walter would have wanted it to be, which is a foundation under a life. Habit's a hard thing to break, and I'm grateful for the habits he gave me. I kept his workshop exactly as it was. Same radio, same one station, the farm reports and Stompin' Tom. I do my own projects out there now, in the warmest room in the house. And sometimes when I'm sanding something down and the cedar smell comes up, I'll catch myself making 2 cups of tea in the morning and pouring one down the sink, and I understand it now in a way I didn't when I was 9. It's not grief, exactly. It's just keeping a chair warm for someone who's not coming, because the keeping is its own kind of love. I don't talk to Colette. My mother and she patch something together. Eventually, the bare minimum 2 sisters can manage, and I don't begrudge my mother that. You don't get to choose your siblings, and you don't owe anybody an explanation for the peace you make. But Colette and I are done, and the strange thing is I'm not angry about it anymore. I used to think the $19,000 was the wound. It wasn't. The wound was discovering that love could be a tool somebody uses on you, that the thing you'd give freely could be the very thing they'd steal. That takes a long time to heal, and you don't heal it by getting the money back. You heal it the way Walter did. You see it clearly, you name it, and then you push it away with one finger and you go on living a life that's too full to be poisoned. People ask me sometimes, friends, Curtis, the guys at the supply counter, whether it was worth it. The year of caregiving, giving up my apartment, burning through my savings, the wars with Colette, the whole heavy mess of it. And I think they expect me to talk about the house, the inheritance, like that was the payoff. But the inheritance wasn't the house. The house is just a house, and a money pit at that, with a driveway that cracks every spring. The inheritance was that year. It was the letters in the closet from a man I thought was quiet. It was learning to bleed a brake line and to apologize when I'm wrong, and learning that the second one is harder. It was a clear morning in May, and my real name in his mouth, and a warm hand in mine. It was $19,000 stolen, and $70,000 left, and the lesson, worth more than both, that you can be robbed and not be ruined, that someone can take what you have and still not touch what you are. I made the story small, like he asked. I buried it with him for the most part, and for a long time I never told it to anyone. But Walter's been gone 3 years now, and I've come to think there's a difference between making a story small and pretending it never happened. He didn't want it to be the thing people remembered about our family. He didn't want bitterness to be his legacy. And it isn't. The legacy is the workshop and the careful money and the 2 cups of tea. But somewhere in there, quiet, is also this: that a confused old man in a kitchen on LaSalle Boulevard, with most of himself already gone, found one clear morning to look his own betrayal in the eye and choose, with $1, to be no one's fool. That's not bitterness. That's dignity. And it's the realest thing he ever left me. So that's the story. The moose card's still in the green cash box, where I keep the few things of his that matter. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe to remember. Maybe to make sure that the next time someone smiles at me with a folio and a plan and a slow, loud voice for the elderly, I recognize the shape of it. Walter taught me a lot of things in that garage with the one-station radio. The last thing he taught me at a kitchen table with a check and a cartoon moose between us, and it was this: love is the only thing worth having, and exactly because of that, it's the only thing worth guarding. Give it freely. But know who you're giving it to. And if someone uses it against you, don't waste your one clear morning on revenge. Just see them clearly, push it away with one finger, and go pour the second cup of tea. It took me a long time to understand that the $19,000 was never really the point. Colette didn't lose her father in the end because of greed alone. She lost him because of 15 years of small, ordinary choices. Every funeral she drove up for, and every plain Tuesday she didn't. Every card that said, "Thinking of you," mailed from 4.5 hours of warmth away. Nothing in that kitchen happened by accident. The window she climbed through existed because she'd spent a decade and a half staying far enough from her father that she could only see him as a resource, never as a man. And Walter's one clear morning happened because I'd spent a year close enough to know which confusion was the disease and which was just an old man being stubborn. Distance and nearness both pay out, eventually. They always do. What I carry from Walter isn't the house or the bit of money left in the credit union. It's the way he handled the worst thing his own daughter ever did to him. He could have raged. He could have called the OPP and put her in handcuffs and been entirely within his rights. Instead, he did the harder thing, which was to look the betrayal dead in the eye, name it out loud, and refuse to let it turn him bitter. That's a kind of strength people rarely talk about. Not the strength to fight, but the strength to stay decent while you're being robbed, to keep your own conduct clean even when someone else has thrown theirs away. He guarded his character harder than he guarded his GACs, and that's why he died a whole man and she walked out of that lawyer's office with $1 and nothing else. I think now that the people who get through life intact are the ones who manage to hold three things at once. They keep their conduct honest even when no one's watching and no one would ever know. They stay sharp enough to read a situation clearly, to tell the difference between someone who loves you and someone using your love as a lever. Walter taught me that with a moose card and a forged signature, and I'll never unlearn it. And they have the grit to keep showing up through the slush and the -30 nights and the back bedroom you weren't ready to deal with, long after the easy part is done. Colette had none of those when it counted. Walter had all three, right to the end. So I pour the second cup of tea every morning, and I leave the workshop radio on its one station, and when somebody smiles at me with a folio and a plan, I remember the shape of it. Give your love freely, but know exactly who you're handing it to. And if someone uses it against you, don't waste your one clear morning on revenge. See them plainly, push it away with one finger, and go on living a life too full to poison.